First of all, again, thank you for being here. Thanks for braving the weather. I know you're used to it, but Robert Louis Stevenson, one of the many things he liked about Saranac Lake is it sort of reminded him of the Scottish Highlands, and so it's fitting maybe that we have some good Highland weather tonight. I'm a writer, so I write my talks. So let me just speak with you informally first, and we'll get into the actual presentation. Just a bit about, so I'm an English professor in Idaho, as Alex mentioned, which is a long ways from here. We learned that firsthand. I drove, my wife and I, my wife Mandy's back here, we drove with our 4 kids, two of whom are here, from Idaho. So the reason I'm here and involved is I came last summer just for my own personal research to the Stevenson Cottage. I read about it for years. I knew a lot about the history, and I wanted to see the site. I wanted to see the collection, and I've been to all the major Stevenson collections in the world. I've been to Scotland, I've been to Samoa, I've been to the collections in California, in Napa Valley, in Monterey. I've done a lot of research at the Beinecke Library at Yale. As far as just artifacts and the collection and the significance of those, I've never seen a better collection than the one we have here. You have something really extraordinary here in Saranac Lake. I spent a couple of days speaking with our resident curator, Mike Delahunt, and locals will know the Delahunt family probably. Their story itself is quite interesting. Mike is a 3rd generation volunteer resident caretaker. His grandfather, 70 years ago, started doing that work. They live in half the house, the half that Andrew and Mary Baker lived in, and the half that the Stevensons rented is exhibit space. So their family, now for 70 years, Mike personally for nearly half a century, has been running this and keeping it afloat and taking care of it and putting a lot of their own time and effort and resources into it. And talking with Mike about that remarkable family history and then what the future would look like, it became clear to me, even as I came to really appreciate just how important this collection and this place was. And as you'll hear in my talk, it was really, Stevenson only lived here 6 months, but those were really a very important 6 months for him. It became clear to me that the museum would need a lot more support and visibility to ensure to put it on a more stable footing for the future. And so I started working with Mike. Tim Holmes, the Stevenson Society of America treasurer and secretary, is here tonight, and he has had a distinguished career in, well, most recently grant writing, but all kinds of other things. And he has been a really essential partner on the ground here at Saranac Lake, and he has a lot of energy and expertise. And I was asked to serve as president of the Stevenson Society of America, which I now am. And here we are. So you'll see me again. I'll be out here in the summers. I do a lot remotely, and I'm really proud to be associated with this institution. Very happy to be here in your town, which is a really remarkable place. So I'll get into the talk here. When we're done though, so yeah, I do have books, which I'm more than happy to sign, and because it's really more Stevenson's book than my book, I had this made a signature stamp, a stamp of Robert Louis Stevenson's signature, so he signs it. And then I sign it too, and I'm happy to mark some essays. And then we have donor gifts. If anyone, you all just by being here have shown interest, and I know a lot of you have supported the museum over the years, where we love to give out these donor bags for any donations of $50 or more, all to the museum. It's unique to have a museum like this, of this significance, that's 100% run by volunteers. So that's it for the sort of informal opening, and let me now get into the talk. Can you hear me okay? I'm not real consistent with this. Okay. From the window above his writing desk in Samoa, Robert Louis Stevenson could see the summit of Mount Vaia, a steep 1,500-foot mountain overlooking the Pacific, running with streams and thickly covered with tropical forest. He'd come to Samoa for health and adventure, the same reason he'd left his native Scotland and crisscrossed the globe, having lived in England, France, Switzerland, California's Bay Area, New York's Adirondacks, and Hawaii before this time. By now, he knew he would never go back to Europe. The nomadic author of Treasure Island, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, and many other great works had finally settled in one place. Vailima, Samoa would be Stevenson's home for the last 4 years of his life. He decided that he would be buried at the top of the adjacent mountain and had his window and desk placed specifically for this view. Every time he sat down to write, in the 4 years prior to 1894, passing at the age of 44, in the 4 years prior to his 1894 passing at age 44, Stevenson was quite literally facing his own death. But this was nothing new. As he reflected in a letter to a friend, "I've had to live nearly all my life in expectation of death. An only child, he'd spent many of his early days on bed rest from respiratory illnesses. In adulthood, he frequently wrote in bed, dictating to his wife or stepdaughter when he was in too much pain to manage a pen, and even signing to a scribe, letter by letter, when the bloody cough of his lung hemorrhages kept him from speaking. His bedside invalid desk and a blood-stained handkerchief monographed with the world-famous initials RLS, now at the Cottage Museum in Saranac Lake, remind us of the conditions in which he wrote." In his adolescence and early adulthood, Stevenson would mope around graveyards where he went specifically to be unhappy. Disinterested in both his university studies and career training in the family business of lighthouse engineering, he devoted himself to writing. Sickly and ambitious, he wrote furiously under the very dart of death and worried he wouldn't live long enough to leave a memory behind him. One of his first professionally published essays, Ordered South, recounts being sent on doctor's orders at 23 to the French Riviera, a good prescription, by the way, if you can get it. In an opening line that also forecasts his time in Saranac Lake, Stevenson reflects, "By a curious irony of fate, the places to which we are sent when health deserts us are often singularly beautiful." In his weakened and sickly state, however, he can appreciate the scene. The world is disenchanted for him. He seems to himself to touch things with muffled hands and to see them through a veil. His life becomes a fumbling after notes rather than the active living he'd imagined. At first, the young writer resists the limitation, but eventually falls contentedly in with the restrictions of his weakness and feels illness weaning him from the passion of life. Concluding that if there is to be no recovery, if never again will he be young and strong and passionate, he waits for death to come quietly and fitly. As an essayist, Stevenson would become known for approaching his illness with courage, insight, and humor, but in his own estimation, he didn't always face death well in his life or in his work. 7 years after writing Ordered South, Stevenson added a note to the end of it, saying that a man who fancies himself dying will get cold comfort from the very youthful view expressed in this essay, explaining that a slightly greater age teaches a slightly different wisdom. He reversed his earlier conclusion. Years later, Stevenson confessed that his morbid haunting of the graveyard in youth was based in self-pity. It was himself that he saw dead. Those were his virtues that were forgotten. His was the vague epitaph. Pity him but the more. For where a man is all pride and personal aspiration, he goes through fire unshielded. By the time Stevenson arrived in Saranac Lake in October of 1887, he had established a career, married and taken on stepchildren, lost his father, grieved friends, and reconsidered his view of illness. Having discarded his earlier resignation towards death, the cowardice that apes a kind of courage, he called it. He had been through more of the fire of life and now had better protection for himself and his readers. Fresh off the success of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, Stevenson arrived in New York City, a worldwide literary celebrity. He signed a lucrative contract with Scribner's magazine to contribute a monthly essay for a year. Ordered north by a physician this time, he relocated with his family to Saranac Lake, where Dr. Edward Trudeau was researching and treating tuberculosis. The essays he wrote at Saranac's Baker Cottage, including The Lantern Bearers, Puvis et Umbra, and A Christmas Sermon, were widely considered some of his greatest contributions to literature. The bracing Adirondack winter suited Stevenson as much as the bright lights of New York celebrity did not. Concluding that fame is nothing to a yacht, he used the health and money he gained in Saranac to travel to the Pacific. For Stevenson, who always took ethical questions seriously, there was no more difficult problem in morality than making a decent and human-hearted convalescence. And the prescription to fight illness in the harsh alpine winters of Switzerland and Saranac Lake fit his temperament. One doctor directed Stevenson to not walk, write, laugh, talk, eat, or drink too much. But he wanted a stirring life or none at all. Having convalesced in the sick rooms of temperate coastal towns in France and England, idle among spiritless idlers, not perhaps yet dying, but hardly living either. He considered that facing the demon of cold through rough journeys in the forest, in mountain air, could help him regain his nerve and self-respect in pursuit of an active life. Whether he was in Switzerland shooting down an alpine slope on a toboggan, or working up a sweat ice skating on Saranac's Moody Pond, these environments not only seemed to benefit his health, but boosted his morale and made him feel stingingly alive. Acknowledging that it was uphill work to fight the sapping malady with one hand, the failing courage with the other. Something about winter in the mountains made him feel that today, if not yesterday, he reached the summit of that hill. Stevenson felt that it was better to lose health like a spendthrift than waste it like a miser. And he valued truly living over merely preserving life. Stevenson wrote to a friend from Baker Cottage, where he would experience temperatures of 48 degrees below zero and get frostbite on his ears. The place of our abode is Saranac Lake in the Adirondacks. It is a mighty good place, and I mean it shall do me good. When Stevenson came to Saranac Lake, Dr. Trudeau's sanatorium had only been here for a few years and did not yet have the national reputation it would later enjoy. Stevenson sought to spread the word through a published letter to the Evening Post. Noting that several newspapers praised the new approach to tuberculosis treatment in Europe and lamented that America did not yet have such sanatoriums, he wrote, "These complaints read to me very strangely in this place, where I am almost within sight of the Adirondack cottages for the treatment of pulmonary disease." Endorsing the treatment, setting, and facilities, he asked, "How shall this continue if even the newspapers are ignorant of their existence?" Stevenson and Trudeau had a warm friendship, but different tastes and temperaments. Trudeau brought Stevenson to the laboratory, where he saw sick animal subjects and looked at death a bit too closely, in the form of tuberculosis bacteria under a microscope. And I learned today that was actually from a piece of lung, right, infected with tuberculosis. So. Little much for Stevenson. Sickened by what he saw, the cause of suffering and loss on a mass scale in microscopic form, he burst out the laboratory door into the night air. Blaming his escape on the scent of the lamps, he explained, "Trudeau, your light may be very bright to you, but to me it smells of oil like the devil." Stevenson's experience here in Trudeau's library helped shape his essay, Pulvis et Umbra, or Dust and Ashes, which he called his Darwinian sermon and wrote at the Saranac Cottage. In the essay, Stevenson reflects, science reports many doubtful things, and all of them appalling, and searches for moral purpose in a world where matter rots uncleanly into something we call life, and is at every level drenched in blood. What a monstrous specter is this man, the disease of the agglutinated dust, killing, feeding, bringing forth small copies of himself, grown upon with hair like grass, a thing to set children screaming. And yet, looked at nearly, how surprising are his attributes. Poor soul, here for so little, cast among so many hardships. Who should have blamed him had he been merely barbarous? And we look abroad and behold him instead filled with imperfect virtues, infinitely childish, often admirably valiant, often touchingly kind, sitting down amidst his momentary life to debate of right and wrong and duty. Appetites are starved, fears conquered, pains supported. Man is indeed marked for failure in his efforts to do right. But where the best consistently miscarry, how tenfold more remarkable that all should continue to strive. Stevenson's fight against death was driven by this continued imperfect striving for right, and by his love of living. For all his health struggles, he seemed to pack several lifetimes' worth of experience into his 44 years, including canoeing across France and Belgium, backpacking 120 miles across a French mountain range with a very stubborn donkey, being arrested as a suspected German spy, inadvertently starting a forest fire in California, and crossing the globe to propose to a married woman, to name only a few. While he loved adventure for its own sake, it was ultimately the thought of duty to others that provided the strongest motivation. The man who has father, mother, wife, sister, friend, and honorable work to live for, he wrote, cannot tamely die without defeat. There are few fights more worthy to be fought, and few victories more to be lauded than those against disease. Not just to survive, but to bear and forbear, help and serve, love and let ourselves be loved for some years longer in this rugged world. Stevenson could be reckless about his health, but maintained, we do not go to cowards for tender dealing, and the man who has least fear for his own carcass has most time to consider others. Perhaps no story from Stevenson's life illustrates this better than his visit to the island of Molokai, against all medical advice, where Hawaiians suffering from Hansen's disease or leprosy were sent for life, cut off from virtually all outside contact. Not wanting to make the patients feel self-conscious, he refused to wear the recommended gloves. He gave the children in the leper settlement a croquet set, saying he wouldn't leave until they could beat him in a game. Stevenson stayed for 8 days, recounting his visit in the essay, Father Damien. Stevenson died in Samoa on December 3rd, 1894, at 44 years old. The details of his last day of life reflect his writing on approaching death. In his essay, Ace Triplets, Stevenson asks, who would find heart enough to begin writing a novel or embark upon any work more considerable than a halfpenny postcard if he dallied with the consideration of death? Stevenson spent his last morning writing his novel, The Weir of Hermiston, which he believed would be his best work of fiction. After working like a steam engine all morning, he paced around the house, talking excitedly about the novel and his plans for future chapters. I love this image of Stevenson. Restless, only hours before his death. In the hot fit of life, laying out vast projects and foundations, flushed with hope, his mouth full of boastful language. Taking his own advice, Stevenson worked on the novel he would never finish. By all means, begin your folio. Even if the doctor does not give you a year, even if he hesitates about a month, make one brave push and see what can be accomplished in a week. It is not only in finished undertakings that we ought to honor useful labor. A spirit goes out of the man who means execution, which outlives the most untimely ending. All who have meant good work with their whole hearts have done good work, although they may die before they have the time to sign it. In a phrase that almost seems to predict the cerebral hemorrhage that would shortly take his life, the last line of the novel reads, "It seemed unprovoked, a willful convulsion of brute nature," as the book ends mid-sentence. On display at the Cottage Museum in Saranac are manuscript pages from this unfinished book and the last pen and ink pot Stevenson ever used. The rest of his time that day was spent trying to carry out his duty to his family. His stepdaughter, Isabel Strong, lived in the home with her son, Austin, and Stevenson gave him a French lesson to prepare for a Christmas recitation. While he was a committed tutor, privately, Stevenson didn't consider his pupil to be very promising, but Austin Strong went on to do the one thing in literature Stevenson never achieved, becoming a successful playwright, best remembered for his play, Seventh Heaven. Stevenson's wife, Fanny, was depressed that day with an uncanny sense of foreboding that something terrible was going to happen. Wanting to cheer her up, Stevenson played cards with her that afternoon. I look at those playing cards now, on display at the Cottage Museum, a game of chance played shortly before his death, and can't help but think of Stevenson's words in a letter 14 years earlier after a particularly close brush with mortality. "It was a toss-up for life or death, but I won the toss, and Hades went off once more. This is not the first time, nor will it be the last, that I have had a friendly game with that gentleman." Only a year earlier, he reflected, "My case is a sport. I may die tonight or live till 60. In his final conscious moments, Stevenson was helping Fanny prepare dressing for a salad. Suddenly, he put both hands to his head and cried out, "What's that?" Asked his wife, "Do I look strange?" and collapsed. In Ace Triplets, Stevenson describes the position of a South American village at the base of an active volcano. The foundation shudders underfoot, the bowels of the mountain growl, and at any moment, living ruin may leap sky high and tumble man and his merrymaking in the dust. In such precarious circumstances, he reflects, even cheese and salad, it seems, could hardly be relished. But this extremity under the volcano, Stevenson reasons, only reflects the ordinary state of mankind, and we find him at the very end, writing ambitious novels, making big plans, working, playing, helping his loved ones, and yes, even relishing salad. As his family tried to make the unconscious writer comfortable, they hesitated before removing his boots, knowing he wanted to die with them on. He was buried in one of his pairs of boots. Another is on display at the Cottage Museum. For all of Stevenson's raging against death, when the critical moment came, he could accept it. Once, during an especially bloody coughing fit, the typically unflappable Fanny was panicked and shaking. Unable to speak, Stevenson signed for a pen and paper and wrote, "Don't be frightened. If this is death, it is an easy one," demonstrating both the courage and tender dealing he admired. His final acceptance of death is etched in stone, over 9,000 miles from his birthplace. On his tomb at the top of Mount Baia, the memento mori, always facing him at his writing desk, is his poem and chosen epitaph, Requiem. Under the wide and starry sky, dig the grave and let me lie. Glad did I live, and gladly die, and I laid me down with a will. This be the verse you graved for me. Here he lies where he longed to be. Home is the sailor, home from sea, and the hunter, home from the hill. The original wood carving for this engraving, and a native Samoan tapa mat draped as an honor over his coffin, are at the Cottage Museum, which he called the hunter's home, and where he recovered between sea voyages. 12 years after Stevenson's death, the 25-year-old writer Stephen Chalmers was diagnosed with tuberculosis of the lungs in New York City. His doctor offered the following prescription: "You will have to leave the city at once, but whatever you do, my boy, don't get the blues. Keep up your courage, fresh air, fresh eggs, and read Robert Louis Stevenson." Chalmers came to Saranac Lake and went on to write Trudeau's biography, The Beloved Physician. He was also a founding member of the Stevenson Society of America, along with other interesting and important people, by the way. One of the founders of the Associated Press was an early founder. At the unveiling, there was Gutzon Borglum, the sculptor of Mount Rushmore, as a relief sculpture of Stevenson, based on a photo of him taken there at the cottage. And that's there, both the bronze black and the original clay relief sculpture there at the cottage. Okay. So Chalmers was also a founding member of the Stevenson Society of America and the author of a wonderful little book, now distributed at the Cottage Museum, on his favorite writer, The Penny Piper of Saranac Lake, an episode in Stevenson's life. But Chalmers and his doctor weren't the only ones to find in Stevenson's work hope to live and courage to die, to quote one of his poems. As an aside, I find these accounts both historically interesting and personally moving. That said, to view Stevenson only as a figure of inspiration or source of moral wisdom, to reduce sophisticated literary art executed at the highest level to extractable lessons, is to overlook the great merit of his work. The Stevenson Society of America was established on October 30th, 1915, to preserve the cottage and its collection as a public museum and, quote, to spread Stevenson's brave philosophy of living. When the museum was established, Dr. Edward Trudeau heard the news from his sick room just 2 weeks before his death and said, "I am glad to have seen it done." A year later, in 1916, the London publisher Chatto and Windus released a popular booklet. I have a copy of it here. It's called Brave Words About Death, from the works of Robert Louis Stevenson. 1916. With passages from Stevenson's essays and letters and ace triplets included in full. It was purposefully printed small enough to fit in a World War I soldier's uniform pocket. It was meant to be read in the trenches, so that, to recall Stevenson's phrase, the soldiers wouldn't go through fire unshielded. I don't think it's a coincidence that this little village, of all the many places Stevenson lived, was the first place in the world to preserve a museum dedicated to his memory. Saranac Lake, though rich in community, natural beauty, and opportunities for adventure, has historically seen more than its share of illness and suffering and death. And Stevenson's life and work, particularly his essays, resonated deeply in this place. I've spoken about some grim topics today, when I might have just as easily spoken on Stevenson's lighter ray, including wonderful essays on children's play, dogs, names, and even umbrellas. For everything we've discussed about Stevenson's moral stance toward death, he also wrote, "There is no duty we so much underrate as the duty of being happy." So to close on a happier note, let me turn from the fires of life's literal and metaphorical battles to the more inviting fireplace at Baker College that warmed and illuminated Stevenson and Trudeau's many talks. Given Stevenson's relatively good health in Saranac, Trudeau didn't need to visit him professionally very much. He was so attractive, however, in conversation, Trudeau recalled, that I found myself, as it was growing dark, very often seated by the big fireplace in the Baker cottage, having a good talk with my illustrious patient. It was really a great privilege, and even if we didn't always agree, the impression of his striking personality, his keen insight into life, his wondrous idealism, his nimble intellect, and his inimitable conversation has grown on me more and more as the years roll by. We were excellent friends. Stevenson's readers felt the same way. As his obituary in the Times lamented, "The world has lost not only a great writer, but a most attractive personality, for his readers everywhere regarded Stevenson not merely as a writer of books, but as a singularly charming, interesting, attractive, personal friend. He had won us all to himself by self-revelations, with an art that was consummate, and bringing before us a personality of the most delightful, the most lovable kind." Stevenson wrote a pair of essays called Talk and Talkers, and by all accounts was a remarkable conversationalist. The good news for us is that Stevenson has the quality he attributed to Montaigne. He retained, after death, the art of making friends. Stevenson sometimes called his essays gossips or chats, and used intimate conversational markers in his writing like, "Let us talk it over between friends." I hope you'll read Stevenson's personal essays, the literary equivalent of fireside chats with the author. I also encourage you to visit or revisit the Stevenson Cottage Museum with all of its treasures, including the actual fireplace Trudeau described, with its burn marks from Stevenson's cigarettes still visible on the mantel. Absent-mindedly, he'd leave them there as he paced the room with the excitement of another conversation, story, or adventure still burning. Thank you. I'd love to take any questions anyone has about the book, the talk, the museum, anything. Please.
Yeah, my question pertains to Stevenson, but also to other authors who wrote extensively, Tolstoy, Jenkins, we could name 100.
Yeah.
Is there any scholarly reference which an annotated bibliography where they describe the individual compositions and give us some sort of guide for which are the better and which are the lesser compositions.
Great question.
The reason I ask is the great novels you mentioned I'm familiar with, but I read one Stevenson story that I didn't like it all. It's called The Merry Men. And so I'm just wondering, are any of the compositions actually scholarly evaluated?
Yes, but there's a caveat with that, which is it changes over time. The scholarship in the humanities is, it's subjective. So one thing I find really interesting, and before I lose track of this, one Stevenson novel I highly recommend, especially to you all here in the Adirondacks, is The Master of Ballantrae, if you haven't read it. He wrote it at Saranac Lake, and it's set partially in the Adirondacks. And a good comparison text, in my mind, is maybe The Count of Monte Cristo by Dumas. It's just a really gripping story. Trudy and Austin, I told our kids that in installments, and they were really engaged by it. But unlike Treasure Island and Kidnapped, he wrote this book for adults, so it's a little darker. It has some sophistication. By the way, I think there's, I have great interest in Treasure Island and Kidnapped, In a Child's Garden of Verses. I have lots to say about those. But The Master of Ballantrae is great. The Weir of Hermiston, which is unfinished, but we know how it would have finished from the notes. Also really compelling. But to your question, there's so many. If you think about literary history, how many great writers, the people now who we consider some of the very best were, minor writers or even dismissed in their time. You think Herman Melville and others. One thing that interested me about this project, so I was introduced, I knew the same thing about Stevenson that everyone did, but my first year as a PhD student at the University of Minnesota, I took a graduate seminar in Victorian fiction. And so we read a number of Stevenson's novels, both the ones that were already familiar to me and the ones I'd never heard of. Stevenson's The Pacific fiction is also great. The Beach of Falacia, some novellas set in the Pacific, in Samoa and Hawaii that I think are really interesting. I was writing about Stevenson and turned to the essays the way lots of scholars have done recently, which is just to illuminate the fiction. Like the assumption being, the fiction's what's important and interesting. Let's see if the essays give me any context. And I was just blown over by the essays. I just found them really thoughtful, quite moving, often funny. And I came to learn that when Stevenson died, many of his contemporaries still thought of him as an essayist first and foremost. Many of them actually thought that's what we'd remember him for, as an essayist. And there are lots of reasons why that didn't happen that way. And they have to do with sort of the ebb and flow of the personal essay as a genre, times that wasn't taken as seriously. Stevenson was already at this peak of celebrity, and then to die young in this romanticized setting of Samoa, there was a real, there's a real sentimental attachment, and so there was a kind of a pushback against that. And so when scholars 50 years ago or so started really paying attention to Stevenson again, because there was a time he was sort of he was always popular, but he was out of scholarly favor for a while. That hasn't been the case now for many, many years. But when scholars started paying attention to him again, they were saying, everyone's focused on Stevenson's essays, let's prioritize the fiction. So we think of that as the reverse now. But I love Stevenson's fiction, but for me, this is I think the very best he wrote. Thank you. Great question. Other questions? Yeah, please.
When he left Saranac Lake to go to Samoa, or traverse across the world, was he aware that he was not going to have as good of health in Samoa, or what was the attraction to Samoa?
He, Yeah, on the ship from the UK to New York, he felt really good, and so he did well at sea. The initial plan was just to take a 6-month cruise, to cruise the Pacific Islands and then come back. He loved being at sea, and they didn't have to do a lot to save money after the time in Saranac, but before, like, they scheduled a cheaper fare, and they went on a steerage ship, so there are horses on the ship, and apes, actually, that were being shipped to American zoos. And so there's a story, there's like a baboon sitting on Stevenson's lap and ruining his clothes. But anyway, I digress. He felt really good at sea, and he thought, like, again, it's always kind of two-part for him. He thought it would be good for his health, but he also just really wanted the adventure. He just had that wanderlust. And so he actually felt, so in Saranac, after his time here, he went 15 months without any serious lung hemorrhages, which was a long time for him. It really did seem to help him. But he also really thrived health-wise in the Pacific. Did eventually die of a cerebral hemorrhage, 6 years after he left here. But while he was in the Pacific, he was swimming, he was hiking, he was horseback riding. He was more active than he'd been able to be in quite a while. Anything else?
One real quick one.
Please.
With the rest of Nordhoff and Hall, Mutiny of the Bounty, they also went to the South Seas. Were they influenced by Stevenson?
Sorry, I didn't hear the first part. Who went to the South Seas?
Nordhoff and Hall, the co-authors of Mutiny on the Bounty, the trilogy. Yeah. They went to the South Seas. I don't know if they went to Samoa, but I wonder.
I don't know, but I'd be very surprised if they weren't influenced by him. You know who was? Jack London was a big Stevenson fan. He kind of followed Stevenson's trail, and if you go to the Jack London house in California, he bought Stevenson's old dishes in China with Vailima on it, just as a memento. So, and Henry James, who is about as different of a fiction writer as one can be from Stevenson. Stevenson's really writing these romance novels, adventure stories. James is sort of high realism. They had opposite views of what fiction should be, but they were very close friends. They traded arguments about fiction in the press, and then got to know each other, and were really close. Stevenson, I mean, his circle of friends is its own interesting story. He was kind of plugged in with everyone, and he was so. I mean, Jekyll and Hyde. When he got. I mean, he was just thronged by reporters here because Jekyll and Hyde had just premiered at the Madison Square Theater. In America, he was quite successful in England and quite well known, but in America, because of the copyright laws, there were pirated editions everywhere of Jekyll and Hyde, and so it was selling in massive numbers, but he wasn't actually making any money from them. And so when he got there, like there was one member of the crew, there were two members of the crew, and one was quite friendly and one really wasn't. And the other passengers, not knowing who Stevenson was, gave him the nickname Jekyll and Hyde. Like it was just like already part of the parlance, And so when he came to America, he's thronged by journalists because it was just the big conversation. And so. So that's. He was so popular that he had a real and far spread influence after that. Certainly, Arthur Conan Doyle, Sherlock Holmes stories, Joseph Conrad, Stevenson was very important for. J.M. Barrie, author of Peter Pan. Right? Stevenson and Barrie never actually met personally, but they had a really warm correspondence through letters. And Captain Hook in Peter Pan mentions Long John Silver. And that, even that second star to the right and straight on till morning is basically Barrie's sort of paraphrase, or like this sort of imagined dialogue of Stevenson giving mock directions to Samoa. And so the Stevenson's influence really runs deep. There is no, the pirate, I mean, think of like pirate lore with the one leg based on his close friend William Ernest Henley, by the way, author of the poem Invictus, who also had one leg. The parrot on his shoulder, that's all Stevenson. Thank you very much. I'd love to sign books. Again, if you'd like to make a donation, of any amount, we'd be thrilled. And $50 or more, we'd love to give you a tote bag with our brand new Robert Louis Stevenson Cottage Museum Saranac Lake logo. So, thanks again.